In 1798, all eyes were on France. The French Revolution had unleashed a political hurricane, and at its center was a young, impossibly ambitious general named Napoleon Bonaparte. His victories in Italy were already the stuff of legend, and his appetite for glory seemed to have no limit. With only Great Britain standing against the French Republic, Napoleon cooked up a plan so audacious, so outrageously bold, it was seen as the ultimate gamble. He turned his eyes east to the ancient land of pyramids and pharaohs. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte, the most brilliant general in Europe, launched his wildest gamble yet. He set sail for Egypt with a massive army, dreaming of an Eastern empire that would sever the lifeline of his greatest enemy, Great Britain. But there was one man standing in his way, the stubborn, relentless British Admiral, Horatio Nelson. This is the story of how Napoleon's ultimate gamble ended in a devastating nightmare in the waters of the Nile. Europe in the late 18th century was tearing itself apart. Revolutionary France, having executed its king, was locked in a bitter fight for survival against the old monarchies of Europe. And at the heart of the opposition was Great Britain, a global maritime superpower. Britain's colonial wealth funded the armies that lined up against France, and Napoleon knew a direct invasion of England was suicide. The Royal Navy was a wooden wall that simply couldn't be breached, so he pitched a far more imaginative strategy. "We must go to the Orient," he declared. "All great glory has been acquired there." His target was Egypt. By conquering this ancient land, Napoleon planned to hit several targets at once. First, he'd choke Britain's incredibly profitable trade routes to India, the crown jewel of its empire. Second, he would plant a permanent French flag in the Middle East, creating a launchpad for future campaigns and a direct challenge to British power in Asia. And finally, driven by his own epic sense of destiny, he wanted to walk in the footsteps of Alexander the Great and carve out his own Eastern Empire. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity. In the spring of 1798, a massive French armada gathered in secret. The scale was staggering. 13 heavy warships called ships of the line, 4 frigates in the main battle fleet with additional escorts, and over 300 transport ships carrying around 35,000 to 40,000 of France's toughest soldiers. But this wasn't just a military force. Napoleon, ever the visionary, also brought along 167 of France's top scientists, engineers, and scholars, ready to map, catalog, and study a land that had fascinated Europe for centuries. The fleet's destination was a state secret, but the British knew something huge was coming, and they sent their most ferocious commander to hunt it down, Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson. What followed was a tense cat-and-mouse game across the Mediterranean. With a fleet of 14 ships of the line, Nelson was obsessed. At one point, a violent storm crippled Nelson's flagship, the Vanguard, and scattered his scouting frigates. In a cruel twist of fate, Napoleon's entire fleet sailed right past him in the confusion, completely unseen. They had missed each other by a matter of hours. The French first stopped at Malta, capturing the strategic island fortress in early June, with barely a shot fired. Days later, they were off again. Nelson, having correctly guessed their destination, had already raced to the Egyptian coast, but found the port of Alexandria completely empty. Frustrated and still without his frigates to scout, he made a critical mistake. He turned back towards Sicily to resupply, convinced he was wrong. Just days later, on July 1st, 1798, Napoleon's fleet appeared off the coast of Egypt. His army began storming ashore and quickly seized the city of Alexandria by July 3rd. With his beachhead secure, Napoleon marched his army into the brutal desert, heading for Cairo. On July 21st, in the shadow of the Great Pyramids, his modern European army faced the Mamluk cavalry. The Battle of the Pyramids was a slaughter. The Mamluks' medieval charges shattered against the disciplined French infantry squares. Napoleon had taken Cairo. He was the master of Egypt. His grand design was unfolding perfectly. It looked like the gamble was about to pay off. While Napoleon was celebrating on land, his naval commander, Vice Admiral Brueys, had a problem. The old harbor at Alexandria was too shallow for his biggest warships, especially his massive 120-gun flagship, L'Orient. Brueys decided to anchor his 13 ships of the line in Aboukir Bay, a wide open bay about 20 kilometers northeast of the city. He thought the position was solid. He lined his ships up for battle, convinced they were protected by shallow waters on one side and a small island fort on the other. But he made a handful of mistakes, and they would all prove fatal. He assumed the British would never risk a chaotic night attack, nor would they be crazy enough to try and squeeze between his ships and the shore. So confident was he that he didn't even bother preparing the guns on the land-facing side of his ships for battle. Worst of all, he only anchored his ships from the front. This allowed them to swing in the current and created just enough of a gap between each vessel for an enemy ship to slip through. Meanwhile, Nelson had resupplied and was back on the hunt, his determination burning hotter than ever. On August 1st, 1798, his long, agonizing search was over. Nor around 2 p.m., his lookouts spotted the French fleet, anchored and exposed. Even with only a few hours of daylight left, Nelson, in his typically aggressive style, ordered an immediate attack. As the British fleet closed in, Nelson's tactical genius saw the deadly flaw in Brueys' formation. This wouldn't be a conventional line-versus-line slugging match. In a flash of brilliance, he made a decision that would redefine naval warfare. He ordered his fleet to split. One column, led by Captain Thomas Foley and HMS Goliath, would take a high-stakes gamble of its own. It would sail into the treacherous shallows behind the French line and attack their unprepared port sides. Nelson's column would attack from the sea as expected. The French vanguard would be caught in a murderous crossfire, hit from both sides with double the firepower. At around 6:30 p.m., as the sun began to set, HMS Goliath led the charge. Foley expertly navigated the shoals, rounded the French line, and unleashed a devastating broadside into the lead French ship, the Guerrier. 5 more British ships followed, each one anchoring and hammering the vulnerable French vessels. The French were stunned. The trap was sprung. Hopelessly outgunned, the lead ships of the French line were systematically torn apart. The Battle of the Nile had begun. The fighting was hellish, a chaotic brawl fought in near-total darkness, lit only by the flash of cannons and the horrifying glow of burning ships. Nelson himself was knocked down by shrapnel to the head and carried below, believing he was about to die, but the battle raged. Then around 10 p.m., the climax arrived. A moment so terrifying it briefly silenced the guns. The French flagship, the magnificent L'Orient, had caught fire. Despite the crew's desperate attempts to fight the flames, they reached the ship's powder magazines. The result was a cataclysm. L'Orient vaporized in a blinding fireball that turned night into day, sending a shockwave for miles. Over 1,000 souls were gone in an instant. Admiral Brueys had already fallen earlier in the battle, struck down by a cannonball that nearly severed his legs. The treasure Napoleon had looted to finance his campaign went with him to the bottom of the bay. For a few terrifying moments, the battle simply stopped, as sailors on both sides stared in shock. The heart of the French fleet had just been ripped out. The morning light of August 2nd revealed a scene from a nightmare. Aboukir Bay was a graveyard of smoldering wreckage. The proud French fleet was gone. Of the 13 battleships Brueys had commanded, 11 were captured or destroyed. Only 2 ships of the line and 2 frigates escaped the slaughter. French casualties were in the thousands. By contrast, the British hadn't lost a single ship. As Nelson later wrote,
"Victory is not a name strong enough for such a scene."
the strategic impact was immediate and catastrophic. With his fleet destroyed, Napoleon and his elite army were trapped. Their link to France, their line of supply, their route for reinforcements, their only way home, was gone. They were stranded in a hostile country, cut off by a royal navy that now had total control of the Mediterranean. The grand dream of an Eastern empire had turned into a strategic prison. The shock waves from the battle spread across the globe. Nelson's victory sent British prestige soaring. It gave Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger the leverage he needed to build a new second coalition against France, as Austria, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, seeing France's weakness, declared war. Yet for all the military failure, the campaign had one accidental, incredible legacy. The team of scholars Napoleon had brought with him performed the first great scientific study of Egypt. Their detailed work and the lucky rediscovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 by an army officer named Pierre-François Bouchard created the entire field of modern Egyptology. It was a stunning intellectual triumph born from a military disaster. For Napoleon, it was a brutal lesson. After a failed and bloody invasion of Syria, he knew the game was up. In August 1799, he abandoned his army, snuck onto a ship, and slipped back to France. Ever the master of propaganda, he carefully spun the story to frame himself as a hero, returning to save the nation from its corrupt government. He would soon seize power in a coup and build the greatest European empire since Rome, but the dream of Eastern glory was dead forever. The Battle of the Nile is one of the most decisive naval battles in history, a turning point that changed the fate of a war. If you enjoy these deep dives into the moments that shaped our world, make sure you're subscribed and hit the like button to help the channel grow. And let us know in the comments, what great commander or epic battle should we cover next? Napoleon's Egyptian campaign started as his most imaginative gamble. It was a brilliant, unconventional plan to cripple Great Britain and build a French empire in the East, echoing the legends of Alexander the Great. But that grand vision was obliterated in a single night of fire and chaos in Aboukir Bay. The Battle of the Nile wasn't just a naval victory, it was a strategic knockout. It stranded France's best army, secured Britain's global trade empire, and kick-started a new war against the French Republic. It proved, in the most brutal way possible, that land-based power and imperial ambition mean nothing without control of the sea. Horatio Nelson became a living legend, the savior of the British nation, his victory cementing his place as one of the greatest naval commanders of all time. Napoleon's ultimate gamble, his bid for an empire to rival the ancients, was drowned in the waters of the Nile. The dream had ended in a nightmare, orchestrated by the genius and sheer relentless will of the man who stood in his way.